Okay, so today we're going to be covering the Siege launch coming up and the changes to PvE card content. As everybody knows, with Siege we're going to have basically a tower system where you're able to put up 3 decks with a bounty on them, and people are able to attack these towers, these 3-deck gauntlets, with PvP standard decks, spending about 40% of the bounty as an entry fee, and a portion of that going towards the bounty reward. Siege is due to release sometime this week. We don't know for sure when. It's still possible it might get delayed, but they're pretty adamant on it coming out this week. They went into changing some PvE cards as a balancing. We agree with some things, we don't agree with other things. We'll touch on that in a bit. And they did want to just change numeric values for the most part, with changing cards being one of the least things they wanted to do, although they changed quite a bit of cards. So the big changes, they really wanted to hit the Spiders deck, and unfortunately hitting the Spiders deck hits our new players pretty hard as well, in my opinion, because this is one of those really easy to get the cards for decks. And Ventio's Gift used to be a 1-mana card, create 2 Tarantula eggs for each opposing champion and put them into their deck. They increased the price to 2, which helps it out a bit. Tarantulas being 5/5 spider, or 5/5 spiders that when they hit the board, destroy an opposing troop. Now it had an equipment that said whenever a spider enters play under your opponent's control, or was it whenever Tarantula enters play under your opponent's control? Anyways, whenever a Tarantula, or I think it was a spider, enters play under your control, it would jump back from your graveyard and go into your hand. Now that equipment reads that you shuffle Ventio's Gift into your deck. Which hits it extremely hard, because the really big benefit of Ventio's Gift is being able to repeatedly shove those Tarantulas into the opponent's deck. We still have the equipment that brings it from 2 to 3 Tarantula eggs, which is a good amount of eggs. Honestly, 3 Tarantulas, or Tarantula eggs, is spooky enough as it is. It's still going to be an okay card, even though they hit it really hard. And a lot of decks that rotated around this card and had combos with this card are no longer going to be able to do what they once did. It's still a strong card. Now, Nausicaa Lookout getting hit, it is a really strong card, and I could see it having some really non-fun to play against in Siege. But I feel like they really wrecked Nausicaa Lookout. Nausicaa Lookout is a 2/2 for 2 when opposing champion, or when a champion plays plays a card. Bury the top card of that champion's deck. They made him into a 2-mana 2/2 when an opposing champion, not both champions, plays a non-resource card rather than any card. Bury the top card of that champion's deck. This makes it bury less than half as many cards and only be effective on your opponent's turn. Now, they didn't only hit it, they hit its really strong equipment too. Its equipment used to be a 10% chance to summon a troop, a random Venom, whenever your opponent plays a card. Now it's a 10% chance to summon a Spiderling. Spiderlings are 1/1 unblockables. 10% chance to summon a Spiderling. I think they could have buffed up that percent chance on this a lot, because 10% doesn't happen as often as you would think. Nausicaa Lookout got hit extremely hard. It wasn't always a snap include in Terra Mill. but it was definitely a card that anybody could run in any kind of Sapphire deck and do something with it, and it was a really big boon for high card playing decks or just decks that want to bury. And the 10% chance to summon a troop was really strong, and having that turned into an equipment that you almost won't even consider putting into the deck is a little bit upsetting. I think they hit Nausicaa Lookout a little bit too hard. Yes, you did need this card to make a good Terramill budget deck. So again, this is one that hurts new players a lot more than it hurts people who have access to more cards, because he was another early campaign card you could get, he was another cheaper card you could get that was really strong for new players, and hitting this card does hit our new players. Now moving on to some of the other PvE changes, Captain's Parrot used to be a 2 mana 0/1, tap to gain 1/0, flight troop when you one shot when you play an action, copy it. Originally they had it released as a 1 mana 0/1, and they nerfed it. That was when it was its strongest. It was really playable then, to a 2 mana 0/1. As a 2 mana card, it really didn't make the cut in most decks. I don't know why this card was touched. I really don't know why Captain's Parrot needs to go to 3. 2, it barely made cuts. On 3, it's really hard to fit into any PvE deck. Spiraling in triggers at the start of turn instead of end of turn. It's a nerf. It's not a huge nerf. I think spiraling in, I think it's an okay nerf. It gives our human players a chance to interact with it, which is what they wanted to do. I'm not terribly upset about this nerf. Cerebral Jackhat deploy add 2 energy counters instead of 3. Cerebral Jackhat is a 2 mana card. When enters play, adds 3 energy counters to it. You tap it, remove an energy counter, and I believe it's draw a card, and it has an equipment where it's draw 2 cards and discard 1 card. Cerebral Jackhat was a really strong draw card. It's still an okay draw card without equipment. It's 2 mana, draw 2 over 2 turns, which isn't as strong as some PvP cards, which is upsetting. But with its equipment, it's still a 2 mana, draw 2, choose and discard a card, which is like a Theorize, but in colorless. And on your following turn, you can do it again. So with its equipment, it's still well above PvP strong, and it is a large nerf to the card, but it's still a good card. So I think this is probably around the right place. I don't know why for sure they touched the Jackhat for Siege. I don't know what interactions they were coming across in testing that really made Jackhat stand out as a card they should nerf. But as far as a nerf goes, I think this is in the right direction. The Ruin of Ripplewood. Now this makes a card that was really strong and was looking for a home into a card that it's still okay, but it's no longer this super strong Sapphire PvE card. And I can see why it's getting nerfed. I could see playing against this card feeling horrible. Instead of putting all cost with X or less into its controller's hand, it's now all cards with cost X into their controller's hand. This making it where it targets certain troops instead of hitting your entire opponent's board. I believe it has an equipment that makes it where it just hits the opponent's side. I'm not completely sure on that. But Ripple of the Ruinwood, or the Ruin of the Ripplewood, I mean, definitely got hit hard by this. Umber Eternus argues that the Siege AI will have no idea how to use this card any longer. It's possible. I mean, they'll still target a card that your opponent has a lot of, or is a threat, most likely. Especially since they're touching this card in particular, but it does make it into a lot worse card for the Siege AI, because the Siege AI is probably not going to target the optimal cards with it. Contract killing, I don't know why they made this change. Contract killing, 0 mana, destroy target troop at the start of your turn if this is in your hand, deals 2 damage to you. It used to be Void instead of Destroy. This kind of makes it not as good against Recursion and, like, Lixil, the Invincible Lixil. I feel like this is more of a nerf against future content updates than it is against Siege. I don't know where, in particular, against a human player, destroy target troop versus void target troop is going to make a huge difference with contract killing. I feel like they may have touched the wrong side of this card. And I feel like this has more implications out of Siege than it does in Siege. Now we have Fever Bloom here. The equipment daisy chain has been changed to deploy put a Dementia Daisy into your hand. Now let's grab this equipment real quick and see what it looks like. So Daisy Chain right now reads 1, bury the top card of each opposing champion's deck as a one-shot. So I feel like this is, in a way, a little bit of a buff, maybe? It's kind of hard to tell, because instead of 1 mana burying 2 cards, possibly more than 2 cards if you have more than 1 Fever Bloom, turning into deploy, add a Dementia Daisy to your hand. Dementia Daisy being a 3-cost card, but a troop that stays on board, and whenever you gain a charge, bury the top 2 cards of each opposing champion's deck. It's a change, and overall a nerf, but it's a really weird change. I think it's going to hurt it a little bit, because when you have multiple Fever's Blooms, being able to 1 mana bury 3 cards, 1 mana bury 4 cards, etc. is going to be would have been a bit more powerful than having a 3 mana troop that has an entirely different interaction. So, it's a change, it's a little bit of a buff, it's a little bit of a nerf. Spirit of Retribution now requires a diamond threshold to be able to cheat it into play with its Spectral Ambush Boots. This is in line with all of their changes to equipment and cards in PvE requiring thresholds instead of just randomly popping into play. They did this with the Ethereal Healers, they did this with all of the Dream cards. I feel like it's very much in line. You're not able to play Spirit of Retribution in a mono blood deck. You have to be able to splash into the thresholds to be able to cheat it into play. I feel like this is very fair and very in line, and it's been with what they've been doing with a lot of other cards. Now we have some changes for the positive side. We have Form the Ranks. Form the Ranks now instead reads +2/+2 instead of +1/+1 for troops that share the same class with you, and its equipment, instead of buffing its power, now says troops that share a trait with you get the bonus. Form the Ranks got a very large buff, an extremely large buff. Being able to 1 mana give everything that shares a trait with you +2/+2 is really good. It's now in line with some PvP cards that have equipment, or better than some PvP cards that have equipment, instead of being similar to. Containment Sphere now costs 3 instead of 6 for its sacrifice effect, which, honestly, it's still not super strong, but this should be how it was printed, honestly. 6 was way too much for this effect. Some of our other bonuses is Hellshot Catapult's now a 3 cost instead of a 5 cost. Hellshot Catapult was almost unplayable. Now it's not as bad. Hellshot Catapult, it's not a significant change, or it's not going to see significant impact on the game. It's not going to see too much impact on Siege, it's not going to see too much impact on PvE. It does give people who are grinding the AZ1, our newer players, a bit of a better time to be able to use this. Same with Containment Sphere's changes, makes Containment Sphere at least a card that our new players can use. Phoenix Guard Harrier went from a 6 cost to a 4 cost, which makes it playable. Phoenix Guard Harrier is now a playable card. It's probably a strong card for Siege, in my opinion. As a 4-drop, 4-drops is probably where you're going to be getting to in Siege. Overall, I think this was a really good buff for Phoenix Guard Harrier. I think the card is kind of in line for this sort of gameplay. It's still not going to be hitting a lot of decks that are trying to play against the AI and win super early, but it's definitely a playable card now. Dream Bear got a buff out of nowhere. I don't know if it needed the buff, but it got +1/+1. Instead of deploy gain 5 health, it's deploy gain 6 health. So the Dream deck got a little bit of buff, Dream Bear got a little bit of a buff. I don't know for sure where the buff came from, and I don't know for sure if it needed the buff. But it just randomly got a buff, I guess. Dreamskarn has a stat increase to a 5/3. I feel like Dreamskarn having a stat increase is significant. Makes it a bit harder to burn out, and makes Dreamskarn a little bit of a better card. It was already a pretty decent card, and I feel like the stat buff to Dreamskarn makes it a lot less susceptible to burn. Dream Turtle got a stat buff. I guess Dream Turtle kind of needed the stat buff a little bit. Dream Turtle, I still am not going to wind up playing it any more than I did before, which is not at all. Dream Spider got a huge change. Dream Spider used to read, when this deals damage to an opposing champion, you would look at the top card, and you could choose to bury that one card. Now, it's when it hits an opposing champion, you bury cards from the top of their deck, from the top of each opposing champion's deck, until you bury a troop. Which is potentially a lot, potentially 1, potentially 2, but it's always a troop bury. But that's not the really strong part. The strong part is it also affected the change to its equipment. Both of its equipments. Dream cards have equipment that allow you to, if you have the proper threshold for them, discard them and get the effect that's on their text box. So Dream Spider, if you have the blood thresholds, I believe it should be a double blood threshold, you're able for no mana, discard it, and bury the top card of your opponent's deck until you bury a troop, which is really good. And now it also has late game stopping power. Whenever a spider you control deals damage, not combat damage, for wherever that matters, maybe you're using tribal warfare or something. When you have a Dream Spider in play, which is a 3-cost card, whenever a spider you control deals damage, bury the top card of your opposing champion's decks until you bury a troop. And with Spiderlings, this is a huge buff. Dream Spider went to not being played to having some of the best equipment for Spiderling decks I could imagine. It's now both your bury effect and your win con. I wonder if the AI is going to be able to play Dream Spider for 3 if you have it equipped with a discard effect, or if it's always going to discard it. It's worth testing that out when Siege comes out. Gnome Wayfarer had its activate cost reduced from 2 to 1, which makes Gnome Wayfarer playable. I've messed around with Gnome Wayfarer in the past. It's really strong, but it's always just been a little bit too slow. It has an equipment that gives it speed. It has an equipment when you use its charge power, you reduce its cost by 1. But Gnome Wayfarer has just been a little bit too slow, and reducing its activate abilities cost by 1 kind of makes it into the playable state. It's still a bit slow, but they turned it from a card that's unplayable or barely playable into a card that is definitely playable. Ghost Sentinel, they reduced the cost from 6 to 5 and stat changes to 4/5. So we're going to go ahead and check out what Ghost Sentinel looks like right now in the current game. Ghost Sentinel right now is a 5/5 for 6. Now it has one of these really interesting equipments that says you have armor 1 for each spirit you control, which is a strong effect. This effect makes it really hard for your opponent to swing past you if you're able to build large spirit boards, and there's a lot of equipment and cards to help you build those larger spirit boards. I don't know for sure how playable this makes Ghost Sentinel, but being a 5 instead of a 6, with a better stat line, because they only reduce the attack by 1, makes it worth looking at. As far as our new players go, I think this makes it into a much better card for our new players. Arcanograph Technician. This has always been a card that isn't super playable, and that's because in the current update, you spell this dude's name? Oh, there's no H. Current update, it costs 7. Basic 7, create an arachnopod, or an arcanobot, sorry, and put it into play. They got rid of the cost for it, and now it's just basic tap, summon an arcanobot. This makes the card much better. Beforehand, it was just way too much to be able to play this card. So, it costs 1 less to summon, and doesn't cost anything to use the activate power. It has some really strong equipment. It still costs 6, which is a big call for in PvE. High cost cards without cost reductions are a way to cheat them into play. tend to overlook being put into decks. But it went into something that you just ignore after seeing its cost into something that you can look at. We have Walking Hive was reduced from 6 to 5. When this attacks, other troops you control get +1/+1 as a 4/5 for 5. With an equipment that I think makes it into +2/+2. This makes it in from a card that was kind of a bad card to a card that isn't terrible. It really isn't super relevant yet. It is an elemental, which means you can do some elemental recursion using Sprite Gang. Or not Sprite Gang, Stormling? Storm Game? Storm Sprite. Storm Sprite's equipment allows you, when you gain 2 charges, to put an elemental from your crypt into play exhausted. So you're able to do some work with that, and Walking Hive being 5 means you can hardcast it as well a bit earlier. And the +1/+1 or +2/+2 if it's equipped is permanent. So Walking Hive is a little bit better to look at than it used to be, but cost 6 to cost 5 isn't too much of a difference for this card. Graveblade Skirmisher, they gave him a lot of buffs. They gave him Rage 1, they gave him Swift Strike, and the stat change is to a 2/1, whereas before, Graveblade was a 3/1. So the attack change isn't much of a change at all, because it has Rage 1 now. And it didn't have Swift Strike before. Giving this troop Swift Strike and Rage 1, along with its recursion effect, makes it into a much more playable card. And I could definitely see looking at this card for mini decks, if I'm doing a multi-shard deck. Ember Brute. Now if you meet his deploy condition, he also gains speed, so he can be a 5/5 for 4 with speed and crush, so he's kind of a Mama Yeti. You control a troop that shares a class with you, this guy's a Mama Yeti. Makes him a lot better? I think this is a pretty good buff. It makes him at least equivalent to Mama Yeti without having to put baby Yetis into your deck. But you do have to put things into your deck that share a class with you or shares a trait with you. Thorn Sprout had its stats changed to a 4/2. I think before Sprout was a 3/2. Is it Spore? Thorn Sprout, not Spore Sprout. Thorn Sprout. Yeah, Thorn Sprout was a 3/2 before. It has an equipment that allows you to get an extra copy of it if you control plant. So being a 4/2 makes your plant deck a little bit better. I kind of like it. Thorn Sprout is one of those things that's always sort of on the edge of if it's going to make it into your deck or not. And this keeps it on the edge, but pushes it a little bit more in favor for making it into your deck. Dark Descent went from a 9 cost to a 7 cost. So it went from extremely high cost to high cost. Void target opposing champion's crypt, summon a zombie for each troop voided this way, gain 2 health for each resource voided this way. Now, Dark Descent I don't think has any kind of cost reduction equipment, so as it is a significant buff, it still doesn't make the card much more playable. Zombies you control gain lethal, or instead void all cards from all crypts. So reducing it from 9 to 7 makes it where it's playable in a ramp deck or sacrificing to increase resources deck. But Dark Descent still isn't a super playable card. It has no cost reduction, it's still right on the edge of being able to be played at 7. In Siege, this might make it played in Siege. I could definitely see it coming around in some weird Siege decks. But any deck you're going to be playing Dark Descent in, you're probably just going to be playing Terror Mill and completely ignoring Dark Descent anyways. I don't feel like this buff was really significant enough to push Dark Descent into playing. Soul of Rekar, or Rager. The buff they made to this card is very significant. They increased his cost by 1, but now his cost reduction triggers while it's either in your hand or your deck, instead of just while it's in your hand. So it's a 4/5 for 10 with flight, deploy void target card, so it's removal, triple diamond threshold, so it's a very high cost to get this guy into play. When a troop you control dies, if this is in your deck or hand, this gets cost -1. So this is a very significant buff to Soul of Rekar. It makes it a lot more playable. It's no longer, oh, I top decked a 10 cost card, well, that's completely dead. It's now a card that you want to draw into. I'm really happy with this buff to Soul of Rekar. Soul of hard to pronounce. Defiler of the Fallen is now a 3-mana 3/3. When power is shifted onto a troop you control, it gets unblockable this turn, instead of a 4-mana 3/3. So it's sort of on the same stat line as a PvP card, maybe? Really, for a rare PvE card, without its equipment, Defiler of the Fallen doesn't seem like it's where it's supposed to be. Let's take a look at what its equipment is. So our equipment is, instead have, when a power is shifted onto a troop you control, it gets unblockable and +2 attack this turn. Deathcry, revert up to 2 target troops you control. Defiler of the Fallen still doesn't seem like it's going to make it into any deck I play anytime soon. I feel like its stat line isn't high enough, its power isn't super high, its equipment isn't all that great, it's only until end of turn. It really just looks like a PvP rare, in my opinion. Gareth K got a small stat bonus, just to make him a little bit stronger as a starting card. I think this is in 9, it's still an okay card. The stat bonus made it a little bit better. I kind of like this buff. Moki having its cost reduced from 5 to 4 is huge. At 5, he was just outside of the bubble, making it into a lot of decks. At 4, he's a 4/3 for 4, deploy, create 2 random orcs of cost 1 and put them into your hand. Now, that's not super great, but his equipment says, when he enters play, create 2 random orcs with cost 1, put them into your hand, they get +1/+1. So, the troops are larger, and instead have deploy summon those orcs with cost 1. So, he could be a stat line of, at the very least, 6/5, summoning 2 orcs, which orcs tend to be really aggressive. There's not too many terrible 1-cost orcs, other than being 1/1 plus an ability, and usually with speed or +1/+1 or plus blank blank is a situation. And with his cost being reduced to 4 after this update, he's on key with finishers. I feel like 4 is an okay spot for any kind of finisher card, and Moki's a finisher card. If you're able to gain charges and you're playing Haraza in Siege, And Moki comes down on 4 and brings 2 dudes along with him, and they all have +1 attack. I feel like the cost reduction for Moki was a really big buff, and it makes him into another finisher that you can play. Nerissa, they made it where instead of having to hit your opponent, or instead of having to deal damage, it's just when she attacks. I feel like that's a buff that she wanted to have, and I really like that buff. So whenever you attack, if the top card of your deck is a troop, draw a card. She has an equipment that makes her a little bit cool for plant decks. I think she can put the card into play. So she can get Swift Strike, and when this deals damage to opposing champion, if the top card of your deck is a plant, put it into play. So I feel like this is a buff that she wanted to have. It makes her a bit more viable. Glendower is now a 2/2 by default instead of a 1/2 by default. It really didn't change anything for Glendower. Like, if they increased his defense by 1, I would have loved it, because I play him in a lot of dwarf decks and he gets burnt a lot. But really, +1 attack isn't much of a change. So these are our PvE changes going into Siege mode. Siege mode is queued to release sometime this week. So we're all super excited about that, and I'd really love to see this update. Does anybody have any